introductory workshop on the ongoing crisis regarding American voting constituencies. And we're going to follow this by a coffee break to discuss whatever strange things I may say today. This event is hosted by the Platypus Affiliated Society. Platypus, established in 2006, organizes reading groups, public fora, research, and journalism focused on problems and tasks inherited from the old 1920s to 1930s, new 1960s to 1970s, and post-political 1980s to 1990s lefts for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. Now, you may learn more about the organization Platypus, including activities local to you, by visiting our website, platypus1917.org. My name is Ethan, and I've been attending Platypus events since the fall of 2006, since before the last major election. Tonight, I will read two short articles to open up a discussion on the shift in electoral politics since the 1960s and how capitalist democracy tasks any purported left. And I think these questions have become rather salient as we get even closer to the 2020 election. As I mentioned, we will follow my remarks with a short coffee break, and that's going to be a really informal question and answer session. Anything is up for grabs. The purpose of a teach-in in Platypus is not to demonstrate any kind of profound expertise. Rather, it's to get a conversation going. And that conversation can be pretty free-flowing, and I look forward to what it brings. But for now, I'm going to open up with the two short articles that I prepared. So the first article is dubbed Up from Neoliberalism, sort of a play on words from the famous William F. Buckley Jr. book, Up from Liberalism. So recently, I indulged the algorithmic exhortations of YouTube by reviewing the 1965 debate at Cambridge between William F. Buckley Jr. and James Baldwin. One thing led to another, and through the power of suggestion, over the course of a weekend, sometime this summer, I think it was, I was compelled to view all 10 of the Buckley-Vidal televised debates during the 1968 presidential campaign. Buckley versus Gore Vidal, talking about the Republicans and Democrats on the nightly news. I also viewed their 2015 treatment in documentary form, The Best of Enemies. These men, Baldwin, Buckley, and Vidal, they were grappling with a seismic shift in the American landscape. The political and social issues of the tumultuous decade of the 1960s, arising in the course of worldwide events, would constitute a tremendous realignment in the voting and governing of America. These issues are still with us today, albeit under great strain in the present crisis. However much Buckley, Vidal, or Baldwin missed the mark, that kind of commentary offered by those gentlemen on the ongoing transformation of society is sorely lacking today. Such commentaries, if had today, would surely be more occluded by immediate party loyalties and would offer much less of the critical distance for reflection that those gentlemen attempted to share. The need for such self-examination in the present is as palpable as its absence. Thus, it is necessary that we make for ourselves the space to pause and think. This is the goal of my teaching tonight. With every formal change in capitalism comes the destruction of the political status quo, as the terms by which capital is managed and reconstituted are renegotiated. The realignment in the 1960s did not arise in a vacuum. Patterns established a century prior were reaching their breaking point, which would force crises in both major electoral parties, which in turn caused a crisis in the American left. And some of the history I'm about to chart is referenced in Chris Cutrone's article on the Gilded Age. You can find that by a quick search of Platypus, the Gilded Age, Cutrone, those keywords. Um, Other history I've come across just in my own readings. Now, we can trace this crisis at least as far back as the Second Industrial Revolution. At the close of the US Civil War, the Republican-led government passed in quick succession the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, firmly establishing themselves as the party to represent the new elements of society, conglomerating in the northern US especially, primarily the millions of blacks entering the workforce. But generally, most minorities, as well as the downtrodden, hoping to stake a claim on society, were all involved. Much of America's left is of radical Republican provenance. By contrast, the Democratic Party in the South was ruined in both reputation and pocketbook. Already having been able to turn the war profitable, Republicans in the North rode the rising tide of US industrialization in the post-war boom. They received the rapidly accumulating capital with open arms. Throughout the 1870s through the 1890s, in the Gilded Age, robber barons attached to the Republican Party earned it the reputation of corruption. But the Democrats were the party of Jim Crow, of the Ku Klux Klan, of secessionist heritage. They had the more infamous image to lose. As Chris Cutrone has written, quote, in the late 19th century in the United States, the Second Industrial Revolution was governed largely by the Republican Party, which was the combined party of progressive liberalism and big capital. The Democratic Party in this period, by contrast, was the party of the middle class and conservatism. So, for instance, populism, as the 1890s Depression phenomenon, fed into the Democratic Party, with William Jennings Bryan, the Democrats' unsuccessful candidate for president in 1896 and again in 1900. But progressivism emerged as a reform effort from within the Republican Party against manifest problems of liberal capitalism in the 1890s to the 1900s, most dramatically under President Theodore Roosevelt, end quote. By the early 20th century, many Democrats adopted progressivism, even in their socially conservative, racist ways. They adopted progressivism to gain a political edge against both big business to the north and the rising tide of socialism across the Atlantic. The Democratic Party promised to put the capital to use that the Republicans would not. With promises to bust the trusts and tax the wealthy to support the little man, the Democrats split the Republican vote between the old-style liberals and the new progressives. This allowed the Democrats to elect Woodrow Wilson as president in 1913. Now, by the time of the Great Depression, the Democrats had solidly become the party of big government and taxes, but also the only depository of hope for the working class. The party of big capital merged with the party of the little man. After all, the Democrats were now one enemy short in that regard, with worldwide efforts for socialism having failed. In the United States, by the time of the 1930s, the Stalinist parties liquidated their support into the Democrats. Minority voters were also slowly peeled away from the Republicans with every new job program and every social welfare plan. The Democrats even seemed to be the ones to thank when fascism in Europe was defeated. As the post-war boom erupted and the era of global imperialist monopoly capitalism shifted to the social democratic welfare state of Fordist Keynesianism, the left was unprepared and was forced to watch from the sidelines while the hegemony of American capital took the lead in the Cold War. Political bombshells abroad, destabilizing official communism, and dissatisfaction at home with the prosperity of the 1950s, these two things birthed the last major upsurge of the left in the 20th century. But the new left, for all its declarations of having broken with the past, still took as its modus operandi the understanding of the old left in the 1930s and 40s. The new left, as it aged into the 1970s, lamented the passing of the welfare state, the same welfare state that a generation prior they had considered conservative and even fascist. In hindsight, their imagination was preoccupied with recovering lost ground in capitalism, not paving the way for future development of socialism. Meanwhile, capitalist politics continued unabated to reform itself as necessary. Unforeseeable even a decade prior, it was finally a Democrat in Lyndon B. Johnson that passed the Civil Rights Act in 1964, while the Republican, Barry Goldwater, opposed it, thus pushing most northern working class minorities into the Democratic Party, the same party for which Martin Luther King's mother swore that a black person would never vote for in good conscience. At the same time, many voters during the 1960s felt a surreptitious authoritarianism, to quote Buckley, was required to achieve the advertised affluence of the Great Society. Uh, Likewise, they were exhausted by the disastrous Vietnam War policies. Finally, they balked at the new social movements of the counterculture being given a hearing in the Democratic Party. Many middle-class racial conservatives moved to the Republican Party. Nixon was the candidate to grab the silent majority in 1968 using his famous Southern strategy. Reagan consolidated this coalition in the 80s amidst the crisis of Fordist Keynesian social democracy. The crisis of that. The left in America protested the emerging neoliberal order to no avail, clinging to the welfare state amidst its disintegration. Massive waves of immigration, coupled with US deindustrialization and the deteriorating conditions among the working class since the mid-70s, these have allowed the Democrats to maintain a steady voting coalition of minorities. The Democrats rely on promises of minimal uplift to the least possible total of Blacks, Latinos, the LGBT, and any other group they can convince to view themselves as a group, especially as a minority, for example, women. To someone figuratively born yesterday, it is speaking to the inherited common sense when Joe Biden says, anyone who does not vote for a Democrat is not Black. Almost finished here. This sea change in the American electorate, by which the party of the KKK became the party of civil rights, while the party of Lincoln and radical emancipation lost itself in conservatism, has hitherto gone without recognition by the American left. Instead, it has been naturalized and transhistoricized in order to make specious claims about the innate racism of Republicans and the bleeding hearts of Democrats. The lies about the party history the left tells itself have become fig leaves covering the shame of being blindsided by history at every turn. Whether these realignments happen organically or whether they are orchestrated by savvy actors intentionally, as you might get the impression from watching the Buckley situation. Whether it's organically or more intentional is unclear. What is clear is the extent to which the left wishes them never to have occurred. The left, with each shift in history lately, seems to fight the disruption, preferring to rest comfortably in the existing arrangements with which they have made their peace. Now along comes Donald Trump in 2016, the great disruptor and swamp clearer, to reshape the voting constituencies in accordance with the new needs of capital amidst the crack-up of neoliberalism. And the left takes affront to him as an assault on the conditions in which they have found themselves so comfortably at home. In the face of Trump, the American left today so desperately defends the very same neoliberal order they opposed in the 1980s on account of its being new. The left is satisfied to join neoliberalism in its deathbed. Trump is attempting to rupture the rackets that make up the current voting blocs by shedding the evangelicals and war hawks, by making overtures to the working person forgotten by Wall Street, and by peeling off minorities from the Democrats. He promises the hope and change that Obama never delivered. But when confronted with a Kanye West or a Candace Owens, the left can only imbibe more of the Democratic Party doxa, to the effect of "you're an Uncle Tom, you're a traitor to your sex," so on and so forth. The left, taking its marching orders from CNBC, CNN, and MSNBC, brands Trump with the same unoriginal epithets, like fascist, that Bush, Reagan, Nixon, Goldwater, and even FDR had heaped upon them. Maybe these kids really were born yesterday, in which case one ought to ask who taught them this behavior rather than teaching them history. The left just wants the Democrats to try harder, to be better. They do not want to compete with them. The left will not build a new home for the blacks of Brexit, for instance. They only want to keep them out of the Republican and in the Democratic Party. They want the Democrats to be honest and accountable, thereby perpetuating their existence. Now, Trump won by successfully appealing to the discontents of neoliberalism. The Democrats want to undo his win by saying neoliberalism really is not so bad. The left fears change and so denounces it using every epithet they can muster, whether it was the Reagan change to neoliberalism or the Trump change to post-neoliberalism. And this is what makes Buckley, for example, a conservative. His desire to return to the more comfortable liberalism of a bygone era that historical necessity had already trampled over. Buckley, in his mission statement for his famous magazine in 1955, famously claimed to be, quote, standing athwart history yelling, "Stop," end quote. Is the left today really so different? Change in capitalism is inevitable. The task is to be as radical as reality itself. The role of driving change in capitalism seems to be chiefly the prerogative of the right, whether of the Republican or Democratic variety. The left is content to tail all change in capitalism, instead of turning the transition periods into opportunities for building political power independent of the two parties. Like Buckley and Vidal and Baldwin noticed in the 60s about their own moment, we too stand on the precipice of a new era of something. Farcically, like the new left then, the millennial left too proved unprepared to render this shift productive. The new left, especially following its Marxist turn after the 1968 year of events, made efforts to achieve political independence from the mainstream and to reconstitute a viable left project that could overcome the opportunism and the treachery of the old left's abandonment of leadership. The new left made that attempt, but they failed in doing so, and only the capable few carried the legacy of this defeat to the next generation. The millennial left, by contrast, made no independent efforts, but rather poured all their energy into Obama and Sanders, thereby wedding an entire generation of the newly politicized to the mendacity of the status quo. Rather than reflect on this double defeat, The left is content to cry crocodile tears on account of Obama not being eligible for a third term or Sanders not having enough mass appeal. As we slide into the unknowable future of post-neoliberal capitalism, Generation Z is coming of age with deadbeat political parents. The Zoomers require an education on the historical baggage that they are to inherit. Otherwise, they are doomed to contribute to the ongoing decline of the left and ever more reckless and opaque cycles of repetition. Okay. So that's my first short piece, and my other piece is shorter. I'm going to take a sip of water. Now, the next piece, and I hope you all got to watch that very short 4 or 5 minute clip of Black Jeopardy from Saturday Night Live. This next piece is called Are Black Politics in Jeopardy? And I'm going to try to unpack some of the rational kernels in the discourse that we hear today. So this election year, amidst the resurgence of Black Lives Matter, a curious video with over 56 million views resurfaced in my Facebook feed from 4 years ago, from 2016. It was one clip of Saturday Night Live's recurring skit, Black Jeopardy, this time featuring Tom Hanks. Tom Hanks is a man named Doug who dons a Make America Great Again hat and a patriotic shirt while sporting a poorly practiced Southern accent. This follows from the other Black Jeopardy skits portraying white people as well-meaning but clueless. The short 6-minute bit parodying a supposed Republican voter is incredible, despite the notoriously Democratic SNL's best efforts. It is incredible. As the contestants work through the categories, it becomes clear that the white people Doug represents and the Black host and contestants really have a lot in common. The racism of the clip comes out in the incredulous shock of the Black people who simply cannot believe a Trump voter could share their viewpoints. Doug, the assigned standard bearer for Trumpism as a racist white Southerner, plays the scratch-off lottery every week, just like his fellow Black contestants. Doug likes thick women too. The host, Darnell, played by Kenan Thompson, is utterly shocked when Doug responds that the government is out to get people using the iPhone thumbprint sensor. The contestants crack a smile when Doug agrees there was a time before Caitlyn Jenner was on the cover of every magazine. Everyone staggers when Doug answers that votes do not count in elections because, quote, they already decided who wins before it happens, end quote. Of course, Darnell chalks this up to Doug following the Illuminati, but they move along in agreement. Doug receives effusive praise when he says he enjoyed the box set of Tyler Perry's Medea movies that he purchased at Walmart because he can laugh and pray in 90 minutes. Kenan Thompson's character, Darnell, extends a handshake to Doug for this, but Tom Hanks is made to react as if he is being mugged before he settles down and goes in for the compliment. Doug even has a fix-it-all neighbor who charges next to nothing for any job, which leads Darnell to say, "You all right, Doug?" I must say, growing up in the South, even I too had a packet drawer. At this point, Doug wants to extend an olive branch, but having heard for years from the woke crowds dead set on overturning integrationist consciousness that Black people are in a fundamentally different community with opposed values. Having heard this all his life, Doug falls back to old canards by saying, "You people are fun. Can I say that?" Uh, Doug falls back on old canards by saying that, is that acceptable to you? The rule makers of community standards is essentially what he's asking. Darnell, in a show of gatekeeper prowess, says, we'll give you a pass this time. The regular rounds of Jeopardy end as Doug is being showered by chants of, go Doug, Doug is my man. Darnell says, Doug, I have to say, and this is against his wishes to concede this, that it has been a pleasure. To which Doug replies, right back at you, my brother. Doug, acknowledging that color is no guarantor of difference, wants to break down the segregationist barriers that wall him off from his fellow community members. It's up to Darnell to accept. The final Jeopardy category is where SNL strikes back against Trump voters, where the category is lives that matter. Doug is met with the condemnatory gaze of his fellow contestants before he even answers. He says he has a lot to say about this, but Darnell cuts the show before he can speak. This is symbolic, of course, of the unwillingness to continue any dialogue in any sphere. Cutting the program before Doug could speak. Should anyone question the authority of slogans or even ask follow-up questions, they are forced by whatever means necessary to silence themselves. Now, why I say this SNL skit is profound, without it meaning to do anything other than demonstrate moral superiority over Trump voters, is this. No answer for the final Jeopardy question is given. The question, what lives matter, is met with only silence. In modern capitalist society, it becomes increasingly true that all lives are expendable. Rackets routinely form to elevate one vulnerable group at the expense of others. But there is no vision for a post-tribal world where all lives matter. And this is where my draft gets a little rough, but we'll work through it. There is a psychological account of homophobia that explains it as conservative jealousy. There are straight people that are sexually unsatisfied, and they cannot take the thought that gay people are having better sex. If I can't have good sex, then they shouldn't either. To the extent that the slogan "All Lives Matter" is an actual response and not blown out of proportion by the media, it seems to me of a similar type. Anyone rejecting the slogan "Black Lives Matter," let's say a white person in this case, may genuinely feel that their own lives do not matter. Of course, to this person chanting Black Lives Matter will sound like Black Lives Matter, but ours do not. And in this way, there is a rational kernel to all lives matter, just as there is an explanation to homophobia that is not simply reducible to prejudiced attitudes. Prejudiced attitudes could not be a basis for social transformation. It is a real problem if people are sexually repressed and unsatisfied. It is a real problem if anyone's life does not matter. Now, I label this as conservative jealousy because the radical response would not be the leveling down impulse to counterpose the slogan "No lives matter," or to say that no sex is allowed, nor would it be a radical response to declare that gay sex matters more than straight sex, or that Black lives matter more than other lives and must be emphasized. All sex must be freed, all lives must be made to matter in a real way. And this is the crisis for SNL viewership, that the Democrats are losing the battle for Black people, and that a major constituency of the Democratic Party thinks that their lives will matter more with another party. The vision, however illusory, that Black people may not go blindly into the voting booth with a blue ballot in hand because the red one offers more hope and change. That keeps Saturday Night Live up at night. This video resurfacing this summer as one last attempt to discipline minorities back into their routine voting patterns. It resurfaced this year for a reason. Fear not, the Republicans do not hold the keys to Black emancipation either. But Trump's efforts to peel away the Kanye Wests of American society does represent an opportunity to question our moment and the ruling rackets that help maintain the status quo. Black people do not need to be fobbed off with frivolous multicultural gestures and appeals to their biology or their so-called Black culture any more than white people, as Doug in SNL represents. It's all American. We need to hear less from Saturday Night Live and more from a force capable of transforming our lives in reality. So that's the end of my second piece. And now, as informally and as productive as we can, we'll have a Q&A session. Who wants to talk first?
Ben, I liked the way that you sorted out your first article, kind of overlaid the Gilded Age or the progression to the turn of the century and later liquidation. So yeah, I'm excited to see what it's going to read like.
There's actually a lot of history that I, of course, didn't have time to get into, and the history that I did get into, you know, I probably missed a detail here and there. I'm not, I command no authority on this history. I just tried to trace generally how American politics have found their basis of support for the last 150 years. And I think I did it because I wanted to emphasize that it's changed over time and it will change again. And it is changing right now. And attempts to stop that change are being veiled. You know, you see different voting constituencies cracking under the pressure of the end of neoliberalism. And I think that reality is not being acknowledged, at least not by the people we care about talking to, not by the left.
So kind of talking about the change that's going on, especially in reference to the, oh, is my mic working?
Yeah, I can hear you, Sebastian.
Oh, very cool. Sorry. Talking about the change in kind of voting demographics and the political change that corresponds to, do you think it's possible for the left to actually capitalize on that in any meaningful way? Because from my perspective, it kind of seems like any attempt to capitalize on that will inevitably be sabotaged by the left.
What do others think?
What was, you said the how exactly would it be sabotaged by the left?
Oh, how do I think the left trying to capitalize on a change in politics and demographics would be sabotaged by itself?
Is that what it's?
Oh, my question was, does anyone think it's possible for the left to make any kind of gains out of the political situation, or is it just kind of something that the left will have to sit out?
Yeah, I think the left kind of just falls back a lot on like just the recent talk you gave about, or the recent kind of example of Black Lives Matter having to be emphasized because there is some kind of inequality, disparity, there's some kind of injustice, right there. And socialism has come to mean not just a tactic for changing the world or anything, but I guess this kind of culture of resistance against oppression, something like that. So any kind of form of oppression needs to be taken up by socialism and kind of put into its center. And this I guess shift to oppression becoming the loci, I guess, of socialism. I was wondering if you had anything to add to that, Ethan, about this I guess this transition in the left itself from understanding class struggle from being an effect of the contradiction of capitalism between the industrial forces of production and the bourgeois revolution of rights, the social relations, bourgeois social relations, and that producing some kind of two different distinct kind of classes producing these effects that end up in this class struggle, whereas now it's really just there's an oppressor and an oppression, and the oppressed must fight against the oppressor, and that's where it begins, I guess.
I learned a lot, I think, from transcribing and just reading over and over again that interview that I know people on this call participated in doing with Andrew Kleiman, the interview in the Platypus Review with Andrew Kleiman from 2019, I guess it was last year, where there's just a sheer inability to come to terms with the fact that Trump won and how he won. And there are still people 4 years later sitting in front of their TV screens with their jaws dropped, still in a state of shock. They still can't figure out why Trump won. And so Kleiman, when he was talking about it in the interview, he had to say that it's all white supremacy. It's all racism and sexism and homophobia, and that's Trump's entire base. And then if you ask him questions about, there are large sociological demographics that shifted from Obama to Trump. How do you explain this? And he had to go back to, well, that's a misleading statistic. They're all racist. And I guess to me, the left, so long as Kleiman is a Marxist in his own understanding, so long as the left tries to do that, it tries and fails to grapple with how Trump won, then I don't think they'll be able to make anything of the shift in political realignment. Because as I tried to suggest in the teach-in tonight, there are real discontents that are coming out of the crack up of neoliberalism. There are real parts of society with real concerns, and politicians have, on both sides of the aisle, have tried to appeal to these discontents. Obama and Trump and Bernie, they're all going after the same country. They all want the votes from the same country, and they're failing or succeeding to get those votes. Now, of course, the largest voting constituency in this country is those that don't vote, the non-voter. And there's a whole other can of worms that I think any socialist movement would have to take seriously. The non-voter, they'd have to politicize people in new ways, and they would have to appeal to them not as if they're already Democrats or they're already Republicans. They just have to appeal to them um, as a potential member of as a voting member of a socialist party. I don't know, how do other people conceive of this?
I think conceiving of like a socialist appeal is kind of hard in this moment. I don't think, despite the word being thrown around, it definitely doesn't feel like it, socialism is in any real way ascendant right now. I think even Platypus favorite theorist Jay Sakai has come out and said something along the lines of, we should be wary of black fascism, because like you see there's a Stalinist group, Black Hammer, that claims to be communist, and they're running around doing racialist politics that does eerily look like black fascism. And I've seen a lot of leftists accept them, despite like their leader made a tweet that was literally something along the lines of "fuck Anne Frank." Like, it just like there's a much more ascendant ability for a racialist politics right now that I think is much more likely to manage to get its foot in the door. I think some kind of group that could very dishonestly claim legacy from more productive forms of black struggle is more likely to emerge than any kind of socialist grouping right now.
Can I respond to the original question for a sec? I thought it was interesting that you said, is this something that the left will have to sit out? Because I think the left sort of cast its dice with the riots that happened recently. Not so much sat out, but rather like actively participated in some way with reaffirming some of the neoliberal political alignments that existed that are kind of coming into crisis with themselves. I thought one perfect example of that is the way that the left really maybe dishonestly misrecognized the relationship of the quote unquote black community with the police. The call to abolish the police that I thought was like put out really, I thought, sort of tried to reaffirm quote unquote community policing, like community ties that are currently coming into crisis with themselves, possibly not realizing that itself the black community is like a political constituency of the Democrats that has always had multiple fault lines along within it, and that they don't maybe perhaps recognize that it's actually cracking up instead of trying to reaffirm it.
And to build off of that, I think one of the things I tried to bring out in my teaching using the SNL skit is the self-discipline of these groups. That you're right, all these so-called communities, even if they are cobbled together as a community, then there are fault lines and they are not monolithic, but you have to veil the differences. You can't look the differences in the face during an election year. You have to stop dissent, and you have to, black people will tell other black people how to vote, and if you don't vote that way, then you're Adolf Reed and you get canceled when you're trying to give a talk. Or if you don't want to vote for Hillary, then you're not a woman anymore. You know, you get all the discipline, the in-group discipline during an election year, and I think the left has hopped on that speeding train. They've hopped on that without a doubt.
Yeah. To add on to that a little, and that's, you know, and to bring it back to what Sebastian was just saying about the possibility of a more explicitly like racialized in a more openly conservative way, the new politics that could come about. I think that this is just like an ultimate symptom of the crack up of what is already like a profoundly racist politics, you know, coming out of the Jim Crow era, et cetera. You know, I think to build on what I was saying about fault lines and what you just mentioned, there's the way that the quote unquote Black community is counterposed to the police, rather than recognizing that there is like a vital relationship of the Black community, quote unquote, and the police. For instance, when the riots were happening, there was a large, you know, somewhat silent, but oftentimes, if you looked hard enough, you'd see them constituency of people who wanted the police to end the riots.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, Black business owners and upper class Black families and people living in Black neighborhoods that, you know, had things that they didn't want destroyed. For instance, people who had local stores they went to, local stores they owned, businesses that they work at there. And I think that the left's attempt to sort of ignore that by counterposing the black race with the police, Black people with the police, is already itself indicative of the implicit racism of that Democrat. So I think like this thing with this guy that you were just mentioning, Sebastian, this guy who has this like kind of like almost like right-wing fascist Black activist group or something. Yeah, I think that's like, rather than being an example of new politics, like he maybe perhaps doesn't consciously recognize that he's very, very much a Democrat.
I think the last thing I would say, and then I'll get it back to Sebastian, is it's politically a non-starter. It demonstrates how unserious the left groups are about building a mass politics. And I'll give you an example. I have a very close friend who is Black, is a woman, and is a police officer. And she's, you know, talked to me about socialism before, and she's like, I'm all for changing society for the better and giving people more freedom. But you're not going to win me over by saying all cops are bastards, because I am one of them. And I feel like at present in this Bonapartist capitalist state, I'm performing a kind of function that you can't just, you know, wish away overnight. And you have to make my job unnecessary. And you can't just tell me I'm a bastard. And I think it not trying to address, you know, the reality of police, and just saying, you know, anybody that supports the police are white supremacists, and you're not really Black if you're going to call 911. To me, it shows how unserious these people are.
I think talking about how kind of unserious that sort of politics is I think that could almost use, rather than taking a left perspective, taking a psychoanalytic perspective, just on the basis of like, I think like ACAB is obviously not originally a leftist slogan. That's a punk slogan that leftists decided was cool enough to use. And I think it's kind of very much a symptom of leftism becoming a subcultural issue, as opposed to like something that's a real political project.
I'd love to have a panel where we could intersect that counterculture of music and leftist politics. I feel like there's a panel there waiting to be had. I just don't know how to curate it.
Oh God,
I couldn't agree more.
I have.
Remember our panelist on the police brutality, anarchist guy. His name's escaping me now. That was
Chaz Buffet. Yeah, he
Chaz
writes
Buffet.
like
That's
his whole publication house is about like radical music.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The term radical music makes me want to throw up. Jesus.
There's a good video of Adorno on YouTube where he's in an interview in German, and they're asking him, what his opinion is of protest music, and he says, something along the lines of, when I hear, the new protest songs against Vietnam, I find them detestable.
Yeah.
As mass culture.
No, it's bad, man. It's like yeah. That being said, though, I think talking about kind of a rise in popularity of kind of a more openly conservative Black politics is definitely, I think referring to it as kind of a callback is a good way of conceptualizing it, because I've seen a lot of people who refer to themselves as part of like a Black radical tradition reference Farrakhan recently, and I've seen a lot more people like openly say good things about the Nation of Islam in a way that seems weird for the modern day.
Oh yeah, I don't know how explicitly far right wing these people I'm about to mention are. I think they're just pretty middle of the road conservative. Some of them even voted Democrat, but the Black names like John McWhorter and Glenn Laurie and Coleman Hughes, they are all they're all exploding in presence on social media and YouTube because of how they're sort of, I don't know, heterodox during these Black Lives Matter protests. And that kind of conservatism is appealing to a lot of people. And I feel like that's the only home for these kinds of dissenters is the right. Like the right now is the only one that's allowing Black people to exist.
Well, I think what's interesting is that there's almost, because that is definitely a trend that is interesting and kind of often ignored or shoved away by Democrats, but the kind of right-wing Black politics I'm thinking about is kind of explicitly pro-riot, like pro-Black Lives Matter, but a lot of the time in a weird way, I think they're a bit more agnostic on the police question, and instead their politics kind of rely on a notion of Black community that means they kind of justify anything that they feel codes as Black. And that's why I think a lot of them identify themselves as on the left, despite like really liking someone like Farrakhan, who's kind of like an open rightist.
It's interesting how in the crack up of neoliberalism, the political tendencies start to look like they did at the beginning of it.
Yeah, what was it? You told me a story the other day about a meeting with the Nation of Islam.
Mm-hmm. And the American Nazi Party, George Lincoln Rockwell's party.
Oh, yeah, Malcolm X was there.
There's a very great picture of George Lincoln Rockwell and two of the leadership of the American Nazi Party. And they're side by side sitting at the National Conference of the Nation of Islam.
There's a bunch of stories like that. Marcus Garvey met with the KKK as well, or I guess not as well, but separately.
Mm-hmm. There's a funny saying that the leader of that Nazi group, the Traditionalist Workers' Party, once said he used to joke and say, "quote, end the hate and separate." And that seems popular.
Oh, this has been a crazy year for like people in academia giving talks about how segregation needs to come back, about how integration is just too exhausting for Black people. And then just the other day, I saw a talk at my alma mater where there was some philosopher dressing up the one-child policy as something we need to institute in America as like a radical thing. And oh God, what a year to live in, huh?
I wish more of them would quote Farrakhan, to be honest, because at least they'd be honest if they did that.
Well, also Farrakhan's a bit more entertaining to listen to.
Well, it just goes to show how obscure this kind of stuff has become, or I guess the better word would be opaque. Whereas I think even going back to what I think the meeting with the Nation of Islam was in the early 60s, maybe the late 50s even, like that was clearly more politically obvious, whereas now it seems almost completely and totally opaque. As in, people did understand that there was a right wing of the, you know, the Black Power movement.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas now, I think because of the total, you know, obscuring with the Democrats, it just completely becomes anything having to do with Black people at all is automatically left wing.
A question I have is, what are we to make about something like QAnon? Is there a radical core that we can get out of something like QAnon?
You know, the one that I always reach for, and this may be preposterous, but I lived with my cousin a few years ago. I lived with him for over a year, and he was a huge QAnon guy. You know, he always said that when Trump wins again in 2020, then Hillary and Obama and Biden, they'll all be like executed on the White House lawn, and then Trump will come get all the child molesters in the government. You know, these kinds of things. And I think the one rational kernel or the one bit of bourgeois ideology I could try to salvage out of it is that it's respectable that they think in terms of conspiracy theories. They think that there are puppet masters pulling strings on society, that there are actually people in charge of this runaway train. Whereas I would conceive of it more as more abstract social domination where we're doing it to ourselves, but it's not like any one person or one group is in control. I don't know, it felt like to me, my cousin was still recognizing some sense of agency, like some sense of conscious control over society, and there's a group doing it. But of course, the conspiracy theory details also can be conservative, and they are conservative. So it's a matter of teasing out what makes sense in it and what's ultimately a dead end.
I feel like it's had a lot of crossover, especially with the avowed left, with the whole Epstein stuff. Like I find that those two like kind of, I guess they're mostly online, but that's where political discourse takes place nowadays. But like it seems like the two of those like groups don't talk to each other, but that they're utterly the exact same. Right? There's like the pedophile, you know, Hollywood elite, and that you know, basically their disagreement is whether Trump is involved or not.
Noah, what do you think about QAnon? I'm wondering what motivated the question.
I've just been doing quite a bit of research on Nazism lately and modern anti-Semitism. And I guess I tend to view it, I tend to view both fascism and Marxism as expressions of a certain modernism, which we've even lost at this point. And in that sense, there is something to be reclaimed from them. There is even a sense of a dialectic in both of them. No matter how deranged it tends to be in anti-Semitism, and how opportunistic it tends to be in fascism and certainly in Marxism. And I tend to wonder if there's a possibility of reclaiming some element of QAnon or making some sort of political project out of it. Not obviously in the fascist element or the white supremacist element or anti-Semitic element, which I think are all sort of bundled into parts of it, but in the general, I suppose, theoretical and philosophical notions of conspiracy theories, of irrationalism projecting itself, and in that sense, becoming a necessary contradiction to rationalism. and in that sense, even exposing rationalism for what it is, which is something that needs to be transcendental.
One of my blind spots is trying to understand how the contemporary right, or anybody that calls themselves like a neo-Nazi, how they trace their lineage back to the original fascists. I'm not sure how they do that, but I know I have a small interest, some kind of abiding interest that I've never quite finished making a teach-in out of, in the growth of fascism out of the death of the left, or at least the failure of the revolution. Fascism coming out of World War I is super fascinating to me. Like Mussolini before the year 1918 would have just looked like a good comrade in the SPD, or the Second International at large, and his understanding how it changes once once World War I is over, and it hasn't ushered into worldwide revolution just yet. How he justifies that as being more radical than Marxism or more revolutionary than the socialist movement is fascinating to me, and I would like to trace that further at some point.
Right. The issue that I would pose with that is that Mussolini is right, that it was more radical because Marxism had collapsed at that point, or was beginning to collapse at the very least. It's certainly something that the left doesn't internalize as much as it should. The calling of everybody from Reagan to Trump fascist, not only with the infantile, I guess, film it has over it, it also has a really symptomatic quality of an absolute, almost self-destruction, and certainly a personal extinction of ideology.
I think in a lot of ways, that's a good point, Noah. There was kind of actually at the time, somewhat of a simultaneous reverence for Lenin and Mussolini at the time of, when Mussolini was kind of coming around and when Lenin was sort of dying. And I think that part of the reason why the left has this like obsession with fascism, why it tends to identify a lot of things as fascism, I'd say particularly Reagan, particularly Trump, was that there are people who recognize what time it is, as in the people who kind of have this imminent, very bourgeois idea that like society transforms itself, and that politics kind of has to keep up with that. Whereas the left sort of, right, and then these are obviously people who are on the right, validly, and that the left also does not share that sort of more, or I guess kind of has to suppress that dialectical recognition. So like the left believes that like neoliberalism could have gone on for 1,000 years, just like I think Fordism could have gone on 1,000 years, right? Whereas Trump kind of just understands himself as doing what society kind of already wants to happen politically.
Although it's really interesting, right? This comes out in some of the articles Chris Cutrone has written for Platypus on the issue of Trump, but this paradoxical notion of Trump, in some dim way, realizes that the times are a-changing, and he's going to be the one to lead us into the era that, of course, the Clintons and the Obamas of the world were incapable of being leaders for. So on the one hand, there's that recognition, but on the other hand, he says he's going to do the same old thing. That he says he's just going to do what Obama and Clinton said they were going to do, but he's actually going to do it. Like they failed to do it, and he's going to do it. The same old things, lower taxes and control immigration and provide jobs, yada yada yada. So he says he's not doing anything particularly radical, but there is something new to it, and I don't know. I'm not quite sure how to understand that.
Well, I think, you mentioned at the beginning of this talk Lenin's quote about, trying to be as radical as reality itself. I think that the right is fully capable of doing that, but not, again, one-sidedly. but like certainly the left suppresses that. I mean, that's an imminent ideology to, to bourgeois society, like that recognition, everyone has it. It's just kind of the degree to which it can be recognized and politicized.
I have a question for everybody on this, which is, to what degree is socialism just fascism, actually?
You can't just leave us hanging. What do you mean by that?
I mean, like, in a sense, the Nazis were insurrectionary. They did look like they were expropriating the capitalists. They did look like they were socializing the economy. It did look like a revolution. It was more militant. It was more youthful. And maybe the socialist revolution from now on is always going to be called fascist.
Mm.
Of course it would be, because, if you have white people expropriating black capitalists, it's going to be called white supremacy, run amok.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And, like Reich's view in a lot of ways towards fascism is the problem was that it was unconscious. And so that's where all the mysticism comes from.
Oh, Reich? Wilhelm Reich?
Wilhelm Reich, yeah, the
Okay.
mass psychology of fascism.
Right, that's a good point. I mean, fascism was doing essentially what the Socialist Party had to do, but for capitalism and not for socialism, right? Because it wasn't conscious of itself.
Yeah, but
been a lot
actually,
of-
let me even follow up on that. What does that mean for capitalism as opposed to socialism? It would be that they did a revolution unconsciously.
Yeah, it's this kind of unconscious, attempts to sort of realize bourgeois right. And maybe that does mean Hitler expropriating capitalists in a certain way, or using the state and the military to sort of dominate them, incorporate them into the state itself. Of course, it's a self-contradictory expression of bourgeois right. But this is exactly what socialism was trying to recognize. And it's exactly what socialism actually, prior to Marx, was.
Because, like a dictatorship of the proletariat should be like, oh, we are administering capitalism. Right, whereas, fascism would have this idea that it was somehow overcoming, I don't know, imperialism of sorts, not necessarily Jewish imperialism.
But I think
Yeah.
in some ways, the dictatorship of the proletariat is an attempt to politicize capitalism, and I think at least Nazism seemed to attempt to depoliticize capitalism, to just kind of suppress the contradictions it could by expropriating capital in some places and privatizing in other places.
Politically.
I mean, I don't think I think I agree with like 95% of that. I don't think the distinguishing feature would be socializing certain parts and privatizing in others, because it could be.
Oh, no, I think my point with that was just like an example. That wasn't a key thing, but yeah.
But no, I certainly agree that yes, it would be the politicization of capital. Yeah, Justin, you were going to say something. I talked over.
No, I was done.
I kind of wanted to gauge the room on the thing I closed the Up from Neoliberalism article with, this idea that Gen Z is coming of age with deadbeat political parents, and that the Zoomers require an education on this historical baggage that they're inheriting. Otherwise, they'll just keep repeating the same old thing in more reckless and more opaque cycles. What does that education mean to you all on historical baggage, and I guess, is the education enough, or how would that look?
I would say in reference to Gen Z, I think that kind of question is why I joined Platypus, because it kind of seemed like the only opportunity to get an education on the baggage of any kind of politics at all, not just left-wing politics.
Have you learned about any baggage?
Yeah, no, I think I'm more likely to just say I have an interest in Marxism than I am a Marxist.
Well, I mean, I think the idea that they need an education is somewhat, maybe obvious to us, but for them, and especially for other leftists, education is almost like something that gets in the way, in that really the purpose is to like go out to where the workers are and just hear what they have to say, and just, I guess, like fashion their demands into some kind of like, anti-capitalist discontent. In a sense, it's basically about tailing the worker rather than getting an education.
I'm not even sure it has anything to do with workers.
Yeah, it sounds like just trying to reestablish neoliberalism.
In the best sense, that's what they would do, is they would just tail the workers.
I think I could talk about Gen Z and politics forever, but I think the main thing is Emilio's right, is I don't think they feel like they need an education. And more than that, I think they mostly reject it when you try to give them one. I mean, I know a shocking amount of people like who are maybe a year or two younger than me who take Grover Furr very seriously. And they know he's lying. There's no way you can look at the cover of any of his books and know he's lying. It's nakedly just like, I just want to believe this.
I think there's a kernel of truth to it, in the sense that like he responds to the worst like Hoover Institute bullshit, basically.
Well, but have you seen the Trotsky book he did?
I know. I know. I'm not saying it's even right. I'm saying like what begets him, in other words, and why are people then attracted to that? In other words, you can find plenty of people on the internet who are like, North Korea, there's no racism there. Like when I used to live in Houston, there was a guy who used to say that. It's like, racism is solved in North Korea. Okay, that's ridiculous. But why is he like drawn to that? Because he hears all the time all sorts of bullshit about, from the Hoover Institute or whatever, the Heritage Foundation in some sense. So when I hear Grover Furr, I'm kind of like, well, these people are responding to that in a certain way, even if it ends up being inane.
No, I think that's fair. I think that's, like inverted American exceptionalism is like a real problem on the left today. I think they get told a few lies in history class and invert their whole world.
I mentioned the teach-in on how fascism comes out of the failure of the revolution. Another thing I've been working on that never quite came to fruition is what we would have to take seriously in Stalinism, and I mean like explicit Stalinism, not like DSA, milk toast, whatever. I mean like the Marxist-Leninist Grover Furr kind of people. And I had that before I joined Platypus, I had my summer of Stalin. I had the sessions where I read nothing but the espresso Stalinist. I had that moment. And I think what you come across is all kinds of facts. You come across things like, well, Stalin can't be such a bad guy because he tried to quit the party 4 times and they wouldn't let him quit the party. And he wasn't power hungry. So you come across facts, right? But what you then have to process is that you can worship the God of the established fact, that facts are just as likely to become ideological and just as likely to bind you to the given reality, as they can still be true and still miss the point, I suppose.
Well, to go back to your original question, Ethan, it made me think about how I think people need this kind of education because they don't understand that they need it. I think that maybe that's why people have a tough time getting on board with education, especially what you were mentioning, Sebastian, how people kind of resist it in a way, because I think it's profoundly uncomfortable to realize how much you don't know. And by that, I mean, like, I'm reminded of my cousin who, for some background, my grandma was like a suffragette or whatever. and my family was accepting an award for her from some historical society, and my cousin was there, and she got mad because the speaker mentioned that previously, in the early 20th century, the Republican Party had been the progressive party. She was like, it's not like it is nowadays. And she got really mad that she said that, because my cousin's like very much a Democrat. I think she didn't realize that there had ever been a difference. And I think that that's part of the thing that people get upset about with this kind of education specifically, because it makes history very, very difficult.
I think that's actually a really important point to make, because the two things that have really stuck in my head lately are there's a study they did in 2016 that I think I mentioned to a bunch of people because get out of my head, is that 50% of Americans I also tweeted it, cannot read in 8th grade level. And also my developmental psych class.
Say that one more time. 50% of Americans can't read at an 8th grade level?
Yeah.
Wow.
And there's also in my developmental psych class that I took at university, decided to tell us that universities, when they started doing studies on the post-formal logic skills and critical thinking skills of university grads, like it was in the 60s or the 80s, and ever since it's just been on a steep decline. Education has failed to provide anything but information and qualifications, and it's getting worse and worse. And I think one thing that isn't mentioned by Marxists a lot is that technology has a lot of good sides, but social media maybe specifically does some bad things to your brain. And I think people are not only less likely to admit that they don't know something, but they are incapable of learning without being taught how to learn, without having some kind of structured experience of learning.
It's part of the shearing effect of capitalist streamlining, I think. You don't have to know as many words. Most of the words in the dictionary are not necessary to making capitalism function. Language can be tremendously shortened, and ways to express yourself you really don't need. And we find more and more people, the way a mentor in Platypus to me would put it, Sebastian, Gabby, most of you know him, Spencer Leonard. The way he would put it is that people are voting with their feet, and they're not going to take a class if they don't feel like it'll help them in the immediate way. Like if it won't help them get a job, or won't help them, get their HR corporation credentials, then they're not gonna take that class. And I think so many parts of the education system are just obviously not necessary for functioning in this society the way it is.
That's a good point. I mean, maybe 50% of people don't read at an 8th grade level, but then again, what is there to read?
What
the fuck are people gonna read?
That is that's something I've had to start reading a lot of Japanese fiction, because it's the only place they produce fiction worth reading anymore, because they still have lit magazines and stuff. And over here, we get one good book every 10 years, and it's inherently a book that was written just to push a Democrat agenda.
Hey, don't talk about the soft socialism of Harry Potter like that.
That's hilarious, Gabby.
Yeah, it was his response to people's outrage at somebody, forget the woman's name, she did Trump impressions with a map or some shit, and then they gave her a Netflix special, and there was outrage over it. And he was like, what art do you think is coming?
Right.
No, it's crazy. My girlfriend went to art school. She's swapped to a real school now, but she was telling me that a bunch of kids in one of her art history classes were really mad that they spent so much time on Picasso, and as a result, apparently most of the stuff they taught about Picasso was about how mean he was to women and that sort of thing instead of his art.
Yeah, they showed Nanette probably.
Oh God.
Yeah, I actually just had a question about your earlier point, Ethan. Can you guys hear me all right?
Yeah, I can hear you.
You pointed out that one problem in academia is that people are just caught up with getting their qualifications so they can enter the workforce in the most convenient way. But then again, there's still people who claim that exactly the opposite is true, that there are too many, millennials going into university getting gender studies degrees instead of STEM and law and, it's really important things according to them. So I'm just kind of, which one is it, or is it both?
Well, of course, Danny, did you have a
One thing, which is that all the STEM fields have been adopting all the gender studies and race study stuff. So I follow the mathematics blog, and it's like, is mathematics racist? Like, this was a blog post a few months back. Sorry, but yeah. And by the way, the Nazis thought mathematics had a racial hierarchy.
Oh, that I love that meme where it's like the white muscular arm and the black muscular arm, and it's like white nationalists and black woke race people, and then they're locking arms. Always an alliance there. No, yeah, I think that gender studies degrees do prepare you to get a job because you got to go manage some HR corporate, discipline class. Robin DiAngelo, do you think how many people do you think are going to get jobs because of the woke white fragility stuff?
Well, it's sorry to butt in here. It's hilarious that people think there's no money in it. Like Trump just had this thing where he ended federal government contracts for diversity training, right? Like these diversity training, and he didn't actually end it. He ended it for specific things that they were trying to get accomplished with it, like certain curricular materials. He won't get rid of the whole thing. Yeah, right, racial sensitivity, but not even all of it, just racial sensitivity training that says specific, this, that, and the other thing. Like there are huge federal government contracts for providing those services.
When and also I think I mentioned this when the white fragility thing was first, like the book first came out, is they're teaching social work master's seminars on it. Like and like that being said though, I think like regardless, I think any humanities program that doesn't provide a pretty decent amount of jobs is being cut right now. Like VCU basically doesn't have a philosophy department anymore.
I think it was a few years ago, the University of Akron cut most of the humanities and went to a game design school. They put all the money in that. I don't know. Yeah, we're seeing really interesting shifts, and I'm sure coronavirus will accelerate it.
I know a common sentiment in Platypus is that you won't get a left education in the university, but today you can't even get a liberal education in the university.
Oh.
And more, people are coming to Platypus without even a basic kind of liberal education, and seeking that maybe in Platypus, seeking that kind of education. So when we ask the question, I guess that the Gen Z needs an education, well, who's going to provide that education? Because the universities won't do it. Platypus, I guess, probably won't do it. Like, I don't think we could do it to give someone that complete education. In a sense, I think sometimes we harken back to the idea of a total culture, I guess, that, emerges within the alternative culture of a socialist movement, a socialist party, that something like the SPD developed, that could provide the kind of education we need. But at the same time, we're saying we need to provide that education, otherwise we keep repeating this problem that ends up in a rut. So it's like we can't get anywhere at all. Like we can't even, the solution we need to get that kind of education requires that education, if that makes sense.
This is backtracking a little bit, but I think one of the first conversations, Justin, you and I had is over this idea that the right says there's cultural Marxism and that the left is controlling our schools. And you're like, there's a rational kernel to that, because there was the march through the institutions. The left did explicitly give up on a mass political movement, and they just decided to, go get jobs teaching the next generation. And so the left is in our schools, but then you said, but they forget that the left is dead. So like they are, the ones giving students an education, but it's not a genuinely, authentically left education. It's a conservative education, just run by the blue team instead of the red team.
Well, it's a left education. It's just not a liberal education. The point is to reassert liberal education.
It's a sub-liberal education. Teaches you how to not be liberal.
Yeah, like the shoot. What is the? I can't believe I'm forgetting this. The Democratic Socialists. Jesus. Like the Democratic Socialists are sub Bernstein. Liberal or left education now is sub-liberal.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah.
Oh, liberal arts are anything but, really.
Bonapartist arts.
Well, I think the conversation, we can wind it down. We've been on for an hour and a half after the teach-in. Did anybody have any final thoughts or questions or comments?
What's next?